damage. You know what? I'm going to put this stumbling block before them. If they trip, oh well. If they don't, oh well. But it's indirect damage. And the Torah is saying both of them are important to understand and both equally liable. And so we go to Rabbeinu Bachya, which, give me 1 second, totally flips this on the head. Again, the reason the Torah uses cursing to death was to teach you to apply logic. So this is what Rabbeinu Bachya says. If the Torah forbids you to curse the deaf person who does not hear it, and therefore does not feel angry or saddened by such treatment of him on your part, how much more so must we not curse those whose faculties of hearing are not impaired? We already know that, right? Okay, if you curse somebody who can't hear, then it's like you haven't cursed them at all, perhaps. All of these directives are designed to improve a person's basic character traits and to ensure that he will not become the victim of bad and addictive habits. This punishment, if you wish, is not about the harm that is done to the person that you are doing the harm to, but rather it's about making your own character better. The prohibition to curse to death is not based about the victim, rather it's about to protect the person doing the cursing. The Torah does not want such a person to even mouth curses where there have no visible effect, right? We should not curse just when don't even see the person. That is what the Torah is trying to teach us when it says do not curse to death. When one has trained oneself to not curse even the deaf, one will be doubly careful not to curse those who can hear. The example is a precedent applying to any situation of a similar nature. Rabbeinu Bachya says the Torah chooses examples from real life. Similarly, the Torah exhorts not to put obstacles in the path of the blind because they are not able to identify who tried to cause them harm, right? If you put something before the blind person cannot tell the person who did that because they can't see. Unfortunately, Rabbeinu Bachya says, people who do have the habit of taking advantage of the helpless and to be guilty of such example is mentioned in the Torah. That's why at the end of the verse it says, "V'yaretem Elohecha ani Adonai," you should fear God, after the warning not to place obstacles in the path who cannot see or cannot hear. The use of the expression, Rabbeinu Bachya says, to fear God, there is no police restraining your behavior. That is when it usually occurs, right? So this is about not only protecting the person who is being cursed or placing the obstacle before them, but it's also protecting the person or building the character of the person that would commit that offense. And so I want to go to two different pieces. Give me 1 second here. We're going to go to some more modern commentary about this. I want to read commentary by a rabbi from the conservative movement who I studied with. Her name is Rabbi Lauren Tuckman, and she herself is blind. And I want to tell you what she says. Give us 1 minute. She writes, towards acceptance, holiness, and removing stumbling blocks. She writes, however, from my perspective, Rashi's figurative reading, right, that it's not just a blind or a deaf person, but it includes everybody, and the laws which grew up from it have, for all intents and purposes, written those with a visual impairment out of this text. So she doesn't agree with Rashi. She says, no, this is for the person who is blind. I have always found the emphasis on Rashi's reading, she says, deeply frustrating for somebody who is actually blind. She writes, stumbling blocks exist in numerous forms: structural, societal, attitudinal, and economic, which makes it exceedingly difficult for people with disabilities to be fully integrated into the larger community. She says she wishes to argue that one of the most substantial of these is society's subconscious view of disability, which is embedded into our language and the way in which we view the world around us. Jewish tradition teaches that all human beings are created b'tselem Elohim. We know in the image of God. We learn that in Breshit. Every human being belongs in our communities. She writes, Rabbi Tuckman, that we need a societal paradigm shift. Instead of looking, she says, at the people with disabilities as expensive and burdensome and difficult, or the last people we should think about because they are marginal, we need to look at every person equally deserving as acceptance. And she finally writes, it's my personal belief that the way to change is to get to know people for who they are, allow them to speak for themselves. She says she knows in her life encountering people from communities I had only heard about or perceived to be marginal has allowed her to educate herself. I vividly remember growing up in my dad's synagogue in Syracuse, New York, and there was a young man who was blind. And I remember going into the library and asking how he could have his bar mitzvah. And there were these gigantic sidurim, and they were filled with bumps. And they were the first Braille sidur that I ever saw. And I remember his bar mitzvah that he read Braille. And it's interesting because even in the Torah, we see different laws that restrict people to read Torah. For instance, how can you read from the Torah if you cannot see it? Or how can you fulfill somebody else's obligation from the Torah if you are deaf and cannot hear, and therefore cannot fulfill others' obligations? And so there's a lot of work being done in terms of enabling people, not restricting people, but enabling people to engage deeply in Jewish life, specifically those with disabilities. I want to do one more source. 1 second here. And it's based on what Rabbi Tuckman said, it is more of a interpretive way of speaking about the blind, but I do want to read it. It says, assisting the perpetrator of an evil deed, and it's by Dr. Meir Tamari. And he really speaks about the blind, right? You shall not put a stumbling block in the path of the blind. The rabbis did not see it as referring to the prevention of placing physical objects in place of a blind person. Again, Rabbi Tuckman will disagree with this. That was understood as a natural morality. So that's the difference. Dr. Tamari says, look, we all know that we should not do that. And so what if we already know that the Torah wouldn't already say it? So it must mean something else. And he says the Torah comes to add dimensions. So lifnei iver means something bigger and wider. And therefore the rabbis say lifnei iver means that somebody should not give unwise business advice to someone or the supply through perfectly legal transactions of goods that are to buyers' moral detriment. If I'm going to sell something that looks perfectly fine, but I do know that whoever buys it will have a detriment to that, then that is putting a stumbling block before the blind. The emphasis, he says, is on the moral detriment of the recipient. He says it is true that one might not sell or give another goods that are physically harmful to him, nor may one, it may be assumed, advertise or encourage him to buy them from somebody else. I remember just last year when I was in a toy store with my kids, and they saw a demonstration of a toy, and they loved it so much that we bought it. We went back to the hotel where we were staying, and the kids opened up the toy from the box, and immediately it was broken. It was done. And my kids basically told me in not this language, but lo titen iver lifnei michshol. Basically, a stumbling block was put before them. Of course, the guy knew how to do it. By the time we got back to the hotel, our kids couldn't do it. So lifnei iver would seem refers to a different category of actions. It affects the moral being of both parties. And this is what Maimonides says, in fact, in his laws of manslaughter. So going to a much deeper topic. Maimonides says, everyone who causes the blind to stumble in anything in which they are not knowledgeable, and knowingly tenders him to advice that is to his detriment, or those who strengthen the hands of evildoers who are figuratively blind, who because of their lust do not see the true way of the mitzvot, transgress the negative commandment of you shall not put a stumbling block before the blind. So it's not about the physical, but rather it is about the moral detriment that you cause the buyer of what you are selling. And he says it's put in two different categories. Number one, assisting a person to perform actions that are detrimental to himself, right? Leading somebody to the wrong action. That's called misaya lidvar avera. And the giving of bad advice, truly incorrect advice. In both cases, Maimonides said the blind person is considered to be the one who is blind or willfully blinds himself to the consequences of what he is doing, right? So actually it is the person who is doing the action that is considered blind because they are willfully blind to the consequences of what they're doing. That all comes from lifnei iver. And so, to conclude for today, at the Peshat level, right? It's don't curse the deaf person. Why? Because of course they cannot hear. And don't put a stumbling block before the blind. Why? Of course, because they cannot see. As Rabbi Lauren Tuckman said, she believes that excludes people who are blind because when the rabbis say, no, it's not that, it's actually larger. But Maimonides comes and says, no, actually, we already know that we should not put a stumbling block before the blind. It must mean something even more. And what is that even more? That the blindness of the moral detriment of the person that is doing something and the consequences that it can lead to. So I hope that in this Parsha of Acharei Kedoshim, the holiness code, how we treat our neighbor should be the way that we want to be treated ourselves, that we too do not place those stumbling blocks before the blind, that we do not curse the deaf, that rather the opposite, that we live a life of Kedusha, that we live a life of holiness and a life of goodness. And we wish you a wonderful week. Have a great day.